At 12 minutes past 7 that morning, armed guards hired by the Homeowners Association stormed Whitmore Ridge Ranch, forced 12 workers against a fence, and began fastening plastic restraints around their wrists. Lorraine Ashford stood beside her black SUV, smiling as she announced that the ranch was being secured for violating community regulations. What she didn't know was that the ranch owner was already racing toward them in an unmarked federal convoy. Silas Whitmore wasn't coming to argue about fences, permits, or association fees. He was the supervisory United States Marshal assigned to execute a federal warrant naming Lorraine her security chief and 3 board members. Stay until the final raid, because Lorraine's biggest mistake wasn't arresting the workers. It was revealing the very evidence Silas needed. Whitmore Ridge Ranch stretched across more than 1,600 acres, bordering the gated luxury community of Silvercrest Estates, though the ranch had stood there decades before the association ever existed. That morning, ranch manager Wade Prescott heard engines rolling in from the eastern road, and he knew immediately it wasn't a single vehicle. 9 black SUVs and 3 pickup trucks arrived in a slow, deliberate line, each one stamped with the logo of the private security firm the association had hired. Roughly 18 guards climbed out, moving with the practiced stiffness of men who had been told this would be easy. Lorraine Ashford walked among them as if she were commanding a raid rather than presiding over a neighborhood board, a folder of papers pressed against her chest like a badge. She announced loudly enough for every worker to hear that the ranch was in violation of what she called an emergency community protection order. Wade had never heard of such a thing, and neither had anyone else standing in that field. Her list of grievances came fast and confident. She claimed the ranch's delivery trucks were using a road that belonged to the association. She claimed dust drifting off the pasture land was harming nearby residents. She claimed the eastern fence encroached on protected landscaping, and she claimed the workers were operating on a strip of land the association believed it held an easement over. Wade asked calmly at first to see a court order authorizing any of this. Lorraine had no court order. Instead, she produced a document bearing the association's own seal, as if a homeowners group could conjure legal authority out of a rubber stamp. Wade actually laughed, and that laugh seemed to be the exact thing that tipped Lorraine over the edge. She turned to her security team and gave the order that would define the rest of her life. "Detain every worker on this property," she said, and the guards moved as though they had been waiting all morning for permission. Cole Brennan, the crew's foreman, stepped forward to object, and 2 guards shoved him hard against the fence rail before he could finish a sentence. Mason Pike, the ranch's equipment operator, felt plastic cuffs bite into his wrists moments later, his tools still lying where he'd dropped them in the dirt. One by one, 12 grown men were forced down along that fence line, their phones confiscated, their trucks blocked in. Lorraine had her people seal the fuel shed chain the workshop doors and bring a front loader rumbling toward the property line as though heavy machinery might finally make her claim look official. Wade warned her flatly that she was committing crimes on private property, and Lorraine only smiled and told him his boss should have learned by now who actually controlled this valley. Wade checked his watch. It read 7:26. He looked at Lorraine with something closer to pity than fear and told her she had picked the absolute wrong morning for this. Lorraine had no idea what he meant because she had built her plan around a version of Silas Whitmore that didn't actually exist. She believed he was simply a wealthy rancher, a stubborn man who refused reasonable offers and needed to be pressured into selling. She had no idea that hours earlier, long before sunrise touched the ridge, Silas had already left home dressed for something far more serious than a fence dispute. He wasn't heading toward his own property that morning. He was heading toward a staging area 2 counties away, where a federal task force was preparing to move. Back at the fence line, the 12 men waited in a silence that felt heavier than the summer heat already pressing down on the field. Mason Pike shifted his weight from boot to boot, testing the plastic cuffs, without much hope of loosening them, while Cole watched the guards for any sign of hesitation he could use. None of the workers had done anything more that morning than show up for their regular shift, and every one of them understood exactly how far Lorraine had overstepped, even if none of them yet understood why. A few guards refused to meet the workers' eyes, clearly uncomfortable with an assignment that felt less like security work and more like something out of a bad dream. Lorraine, however, paced the fence line with the satisfied energy of someone who believed she had finally won a fight she had been losing for over a year. She checked her own watch twice, as if she were timing a delivery rather than an unlawful detention, entirely unaware that the clock she should have been watching belonged to someone else entirely. To understand how the morning arrived at this point, it helps to go back 14 months to when Lorraine Ashford first decided that Silvercrest Estates needed to expand. A regional real estate development firm had approached the association with an offer worth tens of millions of dollars contingent on the association controlling the access road that cut along the eastern edge of Whitmore Ridge. There was only one problem with that plan. That road, every foot of it, belonged to Silas. Lorraine offered to buy it outright, and Silas declined. She raised the offer twice more, each time framing it as generous, and each time Silas said no without explanation. From that refusal, an entire campaign of pressure began to take shape, quiet at first, then increasingly aggressive as the months wore on. The notices started arriving almost weekly. Fines for the height of a fence, fines for the noise of a tractor before 8 in the morning, fines for livestock pens supposedly too close to a shared boundary, fines for delivery trucks, for a hand-painted ranch sign, for anything the association's compliance officers could invent a code section to attach to. There was one glaring issue with all of it. Whitmore Ridge Ranch had never belonged to the Silvercrest Estates Homeowners Association, and Lorraine knew that better than anyone since she had personally reviewed the county plat maps years earlier. She kept sending the notices anyway, betting that persistence alone might eventually wear the ranch down or muddy the legal record enough to matter later. Then the tactics grew stranger and far more troubling. Boundary stakes that had stood untouched for a decade suddenly went missing. A property marker near the ranch's main gate simply vanished one weekend. A surveying crew showed up unannounced one afternoon working a stretch of land. Silas had never authorized anyone to survey. A padlock Wade didn't recognize appeared on a side gate that had never been locked in 20 years. A month after that, a packet of paperwork arrived from the association's attorney, asserting that Silvercrest held a permanent right of access across a section of Whitmore land. When Silas had his own attorney pull the county records, no such easement existed anywhere in the chain of title, and a signature on one supporting document looked distinctly like a forgery. Silas quietly began preserving everything. Every notice, every letter, every strange visit, every photograph of a moved stake or a mystery padlock, all of it went into a growing file he kept separate from his ranch paperwork. What he never told Lorraine, and what almost nobody outside his closest circle knew, was the nature of his actual profession. To most people in the valley, Silas was simply the rancher who traveled often for federal business, vague enough that no one asked too many questions. In reality, he held the title of Supervisory Deputy United States Marshal, overseeing a task force that had until recently had nothing whatsoever to do with his own neighbors. That was about to change. Several months earlier, a regional bank had contacted Silas about a mortgage document tied to a parcel of his land, a document he had never signed and never seen before that phone call. Not long after an investment company reached out asking about development rights on a section of the ranch rights Silas had certainly never sold to anyone. When those documents were eventually routed to federal authorities as part of a broader financial review, a formal investigation opened, and it grew far larger than a single forged mortgage. Special Agent Russell Danner, working the financial side of the case, began tracing where the fraudulent paperwork had originated, and the trail led directly back towards Silvercrest Estates. Silas was instructed to stay quiet, to keep working his ranch as normal, and to let Lorraine keep making her moves without knowing she was being watched. And Lorraine, true to form, kept making them. The investigation carried the internal name Operation Ridgeline, and what began as a narrow inquiry into falsified property filings widened rapidly once Russell started following the money. Silvercrest's Homeowners Association had been funneling payments to 3 separate entities over the previous 3 years: North Valley Compliance Crestline, Security Partners, and a consulting firm called Ashford Development Consulting, a name that needed no further explanation once investigators saw it. Altogether, more than $3,800,000 in resident dues had passed through those 3 companies, money residents believed was funding landscaping crews and community patrols. Worse still, several of the underlying land documents used to justify the association's claims on Whitmore property appeared to have been fabricated from scratch, complete with a notary stamp belonging to someone who had left a profession 2 years earlier. Everett Langford, the association's longtime attorney, began to suspect something was deeply wrong long before the raid ever happened. He had signed a handful of legal letters based entirely on information Lorraine had handed him, trusting her the way any attorney trusts a client of many years. But when he finally sat down and read the Whitmore Ridge easement paperwork line by line, the notary signature stopped him cold, because he personally knew the woman it claimed to belong to, and she hadn't practiced in this county for years. Rather than confront Lorraine directly and risk being shut out of the truth, Everett quietly reached out to federal investigators and became one of their most valuable sources inside the association itself. Through him, Russell's team learned that Lorraine was preparing something even larger than the fines and fake paperwork already on file. If Lorraine could establish on paper and in practice that the association controlled the Eastern Access Road, a developer was prepared to pay $11,400,000 for guaranteed rights to that corridor for a future housing project. To make that claim stick, Lorraine needed evidence that Silvercrest had continuously managed and maintained the road, which meant she needed physical control of it immediately and visibly. She decided the fastest way to manufacture that control was to simply take it by force, sending armed guards to occupy the property and treat it as association territory before anyone could challenge her. As it happened, the very morning she chose for that seizure was the same morning a federal judge had already signed a stack of warrants against her. Those warrants authorized a search of the association's offices, a search of the security company's records, seizure of internal servers, and arrests for Lorraine Ashford, her chief of security, and 2 board members who had signed off on the fraudulent filings. Silas had been assigned to help coordinate that very execution, unaware that Lorraine on that exact same morning had decided to march her guards straight onto his land. It was a coincidence almost too strange to believe, the kind of timing that only made sense once every piece of the story came together later. Lorraine had no idea any of this was happening as she stood in that field dictating orders and watching her guards zip-tie ranch workers who had done nothing wrong. She believed she was finally winning a year-long standoff over a dirt road. In truth, she was about to hand federal investigators the final piece of evidence they needed delivered directly into their hands by her own decision to trespass. Naomi Calder had spent the drive out reviewing the warrant packet one final time, checking names, addresses, and the exact sequence in which arrests were meant to occur. Russell Danner rode 2 vehicles back, a laptop balanced on his knees, still cross-referencing bank transfers against the shell companies that had first drawn his attention months earlier. Neither of them had any reason to expect the scene they would find when the convoy finally crested the ridge above Whitmore land. In the world of federal investigations, subjects rarely handed over their own downfall so plainly, and yet that was precisely what Lorraine's morning had set in motion. The task force had planned for resistance, for lawyers, for stalling tactics, but nothing in their briefing had prepared them for arriving at the very property Lorraine had chosen to raid, discovering 13 bound witnesses waiting to describe everything she had done in the hours before their arrival. Back at the ranch, Lorraine's confidence only grew as the minutes passed. Wade insisted she call Sheriff Malcolm Reeve immediately, and Lorraine laughed off the suggestion, claiming she had already notified the sheriff's office of the operation. In reality, she had placed one call to a deputy she knew, socially describing the situation as nothing more than a civil property dispute that didn't require anyone's urgent attention. She turned toward Cole Brennan and told him to instruct his men to leave the premises immediately, as though the crew still had any freedom of movement at all. Cole raised his zip-tied wrists in response, reminding her that her own people had just arrested them minutes earlier. Lorraine corrected him coolly, calling it a temporary detention rather than an arrest, a distinction that meant nothing to the men still pinned against that fence. Wade told her plainly that private security guards had no legal authority to detain ranch employees simply because the association disliked them, and Lorraine responded as though the observation were beneath her notice. She ordered the front loader forward, aiming to tear open a section of fence and physically clear a path for association vehicles along the eastern road. One of the guards operating the machine hesitated, glancing toward Lorraine as if hoping she might reconsider, and she snapped at him to do it now. The loader's bucket dropped, and the first fence post cracked loose from the ground in a spray of dust and splintered wood. Wade's eyes flicked toward the security camera mounted above the equipment shed, quietly grateful that every second of this was being recorded. Lorraine, meanwhile, walked into the ranch office and lifted a folder off the desk, a decision that would end up mattering far more than the broken fence ever did. Inside that folder were copies of the very financial documents Silas had spent months quietly assembling, records connecting the association's payments to the same shell companies Russell Danner had already flagged. Lorraine's eyes caught one company name in particular, and for a single unguarded moment her composure cracked completely. Wade noticed it instantly, the flicker of panic behind her otherwise practiced calm, and Lorraine shoved the folder into her bag before anyone could stop her. Wade told her flatly that she had just stolen evidence from private property, and Lorraine, rattled now, ordered her guards to detain him as well. Within seconds, Wade's wrists were bound alongside the others, bringing the total number of people held on that fence line to 13. One of the workers asked her, almost daring her, what would happen once Silas actually arrived, and Lorraine answered without hesitation that she hoped he would. Her wish was granted almost immediately. A guard stationed at the main gate called in over the radio that vehicles were approaching from the county road. Lorraine walked toward the entrance, expecting to see a lawyer or maybe a sympathetic deputy arriving to smooth things over in her favor. Instead, a black Chevrolet Tahoe crested the rise first, followed by a second, then a third, then several more rolling in behind them in tight formation. None of the vehicles carried a single logo. None of them had emergency lights flashing, which somehow made their approach feel even more deliberate. Lorraine smiled anyway, still convinced this was simply local law enforcement finally showing up to back her play, while Wade, watching the same convoy, said quietly to no one in particular that this was him. 7 federal vehicles in total rolled through the gate that Lorraine's guards had seized less than an hour earlier. The lead vehicle stopped directly in front of the broken fence line, and its door opened slowly. Silas Whitmore stepped out, and he was not dressed as a rancher that morning. He wore a tactical vest with a badge unmistakably visible across his chest, reading United States Marshal in letters no one could argue with. Lorraine froze completely, the folder still clutched in her hand, as Silas turned his gaze toward the line of bound workers along the fence. He didn't rush toward them. He didn't raise his voice. He simply stood there for a long moment, taking in every detail of what Lorraine had done to his crew. One of the association's security guards stepped forward, first trying to reassert some sense of authority, explaining that this was a controlled enforcement operation authorized by the homeowners association. Silas asked him a single question in return, wanting to know exactly who had given the order to physically restrain these men. The guard's eyes drifted immediately toward Lorraine, answering the question without a word needing to be said. Silas turned to face her directly, and Lorraine tried desperately to recover her footing, telling him this was strictly a matter between the association and his ranch. Silas told her that roughly 30 seconds ago it had become something else entirely. Deputy Marshal Naomi Calder stepped down from the second vehicle, as the rest of the team fanned out across the property with practiced coordination. Silas ordered every association security officer present to keep their hands visible, and the shift in atmosphere was immediate and unmistakable. Lorraine, grasping at whatever authority she had left, insisted he had no jurisdiction to interfere in an association matter of this kind. Silas told her plainly that he wasn't there for the association matter at all, and reached into his vest to produce a folded set of documents. Lorraine watched as he unfolded them, and the federal court seal stamped across the top made her smile vanish completely. Silas said her full name aloud, and Lorraine said nothing in return because there was nothing left to say. He told her this was a federal warrant, and the charges attached to it were serious enough to end everything she had spent the past 14 months building. Conspiracy to commit wire fraud, fraudulent property filings, obstruction, theft of protected records. Lorraine's eyes darted toward her security vehicles as though escape might still be possible, and Silas added, almost as an afterthought, that after witnessing what had just happened on his property, several additional charges were likely to follow. A handful of the association's guards lowered their weapons on the spot, sensing exactly which direction the morning had turned. Gavin Rourke, the head of security, was not one of them, insisting loudly that his team had acted entirely within their legal authority. Silas asked him a series of short, pointed questions. Did he have an arrest warrant for any of these workers? He did not. Did he have a court order authorizing detention on this property? He did not. Did he hold any actual law enforcement commission of any kind? He did not. Silas told him in that case to unlock every single worker immediately, and when Gavin hesitated, Naomi Calder stepped forward and repeated the order with far less patience. One by one, the association's guards began cutting the plastic restraints from the wrists of the men they had bound less than an hour earlier. Lorraine watched her entire operation unravel in real time, and finally managed only 3 words in Silas's direction, accusing him of setting the whole thing up. Silas answered simply that he hadn't set up anything, and reminded her that he had spent 14 months telling her to stay off his property. A warning she had chosen to ignore, right up until the moment it cost her everything. While the workers were being freed, Silas noticed something was missing from Wade's usual paperwork, and Wade explained that Lorraine had taken a folder directly from the office desk. Silas turned to her without raising his voice and asked exactly what she had removed. Lorraine denied taking anything at all, a denial that lasted only until Naomi pointed out that the security camera above the shed had captured the entire moment on video. Under the scope of the arrest warrant, agents searched the bag still hanging from Lorraine's shoulder, and inside they found the very folder Wade had described. Special Agent Russell Danner arrived from the 6th vehicle and opened it carefully, scanning through the contents until one particular document caught his attention completely. It was a printed internal email exchange between Lorraine and the developer she had been negotiating with, and one line in particular stood out starkly against everything else on the page. It read that once access through Whitmore was under the association's control, the next phase of the project could officially close. Lorraine immediately claimed the document had been stolen from association files, a claim that unintentionally confirmed the email was authentic in the first place. Silas pointed that out to her, calmly noting that she had just admitted without meaning to that everything in the folder was real. Lorraine realized too late what she had done, the trap closing not because anyone had said it, but because her own instinct to grab evidence had walked it straight into federal hands. Russell kept reading, and the deeper he went, the worse it became for her. A payment ledger inside the folder listed $220,000 allocated for what was labeled security mobilization, $95,000 for boundary enforcement, and $430,000 scheduled to be paid once the easement claim was formally confirmed. A final bonus line promised an additional payout if Whitmore Ridge could be pressured into signing an access agreement outright. Silas didn't need to say much more at that point because the documents were already speaking for themselves in a way no denial could undo. Lorraine had walked onto Federal Marshal's radar, carrying in her own hands the single most damaging piece of evidence in the entire case. Still unwilling to accept how quickly things had turned, Lorraine shouted at her security team to stop answering any questions from the agents around them. Silas told her without any particular emphasis that the instruction itself might become another problem for her later. Gavin Rourke, visibly shaken, now asked whether he personally was going to be arrested, and Russell told him that would depend entirely on his actions from this point forward, and the evidence already gathered against him. Gavin looked at Lorraine for a long moment, and something in his expression finally shifted from loyalty to self-preservation. He told the agents that Lorraine had informed the entire security team the county had already approved this operation. Lorraine spun toward him and told him sharply to be quiet, but it was far too late for that. Gavin kept talking anyway, telling investigators that Lorraine had also claimed Whitmore had already lost a property challenge, which was a complete fabrication meant to justify the raid to her own hired guards. Lorraine's voice rose into something close to a scream, and Naomi Calder simply glanced toward Silas, both of them recognizing the same thing at once. The wall of loyalty Lorraine had built around herself was collapsing in real time, one guard at a time, right there in the middle of the field she had tried to seize. Silas had no intention of letting the case end at the ranch that morning. A portion of the federal team remained behind to secure the scene and preserve every remaining piece of physical evidence. The rest of the convoy moved directly towards Silvercrest's Association headquarters, where word of the morning's events had already begun spreading through the community faster than anyone could contain it. Lorraine, still under guard, kept insisting the office had already been cleared of anything sensitive, clinging to the belief that her paper trail had been erased. But when the marshals entered the building, Russell discovered the association's internal camera system was still fully operational, and the servers hadn't been wiped as thoroughly as she believed. Federal technicians recovered the deleted files within hours, and one folder in particular stopped the entire team cold once they opened it. Labeled Ridgeline Expansion, it contained detailed maps of Whitmore land-altered property records, scanned signatures pulled from unrelated documents, and a step-by-step escalation plan written out almost like a project timeline. The plan called for increasing fines first, then restricting road access, then manufacturing an easement dispute, then inserting security personnel to establish physical control, and finally pressuring the landowner into a forced sale. Silas read through it without any visible reaction, though. Wade, once he was told the details later that day, understood immediately that this had never been about a fence or a few dollars in dues. It had always been about squeezing millions out of a piece of land that was never Lorraine's to take. The search continued into the association's private office safe, where agents found a small collection of notary stamps, one of which bore the name of a notary public who had stopped practicing more than 2 years earlier. Russell noted dryly that explaining that particular detail in court was going to be difficult for anyone involved. Everett Langford arrived shortly afterward with his own attorney at his side, formally offering his full cooperation with the investigation. He handed over a small flash drive containing an email exchange in which Lorraine had asked him directly to find some way to make the fraudulent easement legally enforceable. Everett had refused her outright at the time, which was exactly why she had turned to a different, far less scrupulous attorney to draft the paperwork instead. What had started as a story about an overbearing homeowners association had by that afternoon become something closer to a full-scale organized fraud investigation. In the days immediately following the raid, the community around Silvercrest Estates split into two increasingly loud camps. Some residents defended Lorraine publicly, insisting the whole affair had to be some kind of misunderstanding blown wildly out of proportion by an aggressive federal agency. Others, particularly those who had quietly questioned the association's finances for years, felt a strange mixture of vindication and dread as details of the case began leaking into local news coverage. Sheriff Malcolm Reeve, who had initially brushed off Lorraine's vague phone call as nothing more than a routine neighbor dispute, found himself fielding a very different kind of call. Once federal agents requested his department's cooperation, he reviewed the ranch's surveillance footage personally and told his own deputies afterward that he had never seen a civilian organization overstep its authority so completely or so publicly. From that point forward, his office worked alongside the marshals rather than around them, providing local records and witness statements that further strengthened the case against Lorraine and her closest allies on the board. Lorraine's legal team, freshly retained and expensive, attempted a different strategy almost immediately. They argued publicly that Silas had exploited his federal position to settle what was fundamentally a personal property dispute involving his own ranch. They claimed his direct involvement in an operation targeting an organization he was actively feuding with represented an obvious conflict of interest. Silas, however, had anticipated exactly this argument long before the raid ever happened. The moment the Ridgeline investigation had begun touching Silvercrest, he had formally disclosed his property relationship to his supervisors and to the presiding judge overseeing the case. Both had reviewed and approved the precise scope of his assigned duties well in advance, ensuring nothing about that morning's warrant execution fell outside proper procedure. More importantly, Silas held no personal authority over whether charges were ultimately filed against anyone. The evidence had been gathered independently by multiple federal agencies, working the financial and property fraud angles for months. Lorraine tried a public relations approach next, framing herself publicly as a dedicated volunteer simply protecting her community from an uncooperative neighbor. That framing collapsed the moment footage from the ranch's own security cameras became part of the official court record for everyone to see. The footage showed her ordering the detention of unarmed workers, ordering the confiscation of their phones, ordering her guards to tear down the fence, and finally taking the folder from Wade's office herself. One particular clip did more damage to her defense than almost anything else in the entire case. In it, Wade warned her clearly that she was trespassing on private property in front of multiple witnesses, and Lorraine responded on camera that by nightfall the road would belong to the association regardless. There was no way to spin that sentence into a misunderstanding or an overreaction born of good intentions. Around the same time, several association members who had grown suspicious of Lorraine over the preceding year began speaking openly with investigators. They described being kept in the dark about certain contracts and expenditures that never appeared on any official financial report shared with residents. Homeowners soon discovered their own dues, had quietly financed a secret legal campaign designed to seize control of land that never belonged to their community in the first place. And whatever sympathy remained for Lorraine evaporated almost overnight. What came next surprised even the investigators who thought they had already uncovered the full scope of the scheme. Silas and Russell discovered that Lorraine had not been acting entirely alone in orchestrating the plan. A regional real estate developer named Bennett Crowley had promised a substantial payout to Lorraine's team the moment they secured legitimate access rights across Whitmore land. Crowley later claimed he believed the association's paperwork existed in some kind of legal gray area, insisting he had no idea any of it had been outright forged. Once federal agents confronted him directly with the growing evidence, he cooperated, quickly handing over an extensive email history between himself and Lorraine that filled in the remaining gaps of the case. One email from Lorraine read plainly that Whitmore would never agree to sell voluntarily, so they would simply manufacture enough leverage until he had no practical choice left. A second email stated that establishing a visible security presence on the property would lock in physical control before he had any real opportunity to respond. The morning she sent armed guards to detain the ranch's entire crew had in fact been the final phase of that exact plan. She intended to seize the road, station equipment along it, install a barrier at the property line, and then publicly claim the association had achieved practical, demonstrable control of the corridor. Instead, she carried out that plan on the precise morning a federal court had already authorized her own arrest, walking directly into the operation meant to bring her down. 3 months later, a federal grand jury returned an expanded indictment covering the full breadth of what investigators had uncovered. The charges included conspiracy wire fraud, use of fraudulent instruments, obstruction of justice theft, and a lengthy list of additional financial crimes tied to the shell companies and falsified property records. The unlawful detention of the ranch workers was ultimately handled separately under state law, layered on top of the broader federal case against her. Gavin Rourke accepted a cooperation agreement soon after providing sworn testimony that Lorraine had deliberately lied to her own security team about the legal authority behind that morning's operation. Several board members who claimed no knowledge of the underlying fraud were spared criminal charges but were forced to resign from their positions regardless. And Silvercrest Estates held a new election for its board of directors not long afterward. Lorraine Ashford's name appeared nowhere on the ballot. Everett Langford, for his part, spent the following weeks rebuilding a professional reputation that Lorraine's scheme had nearly dragged down alongside her own. He testified at length about the pressure she had placed on him to draft increasingly aggressive legal letters, and about the moment he finally refused to put his name on paperwork he could not verify. Several residents later admitted they had assumed his office was simply following Lorraine's direction without question, and his willingness to cooperate openly with investigators went a long way toward repairing that assumption. Bennett Crowley's development deal collapsed entirely. Once news of the fraud became public, costing him a project he had spent years assembling. Though his early cooperation with federal agents ultimately spared him from facing charges of his own. Gavin Rourke's testimony, delivered under the terms of his cooperation agreement, became one of the most damaging elements of the entire trial, since it came directly from someone Lorraine had trusted to carry out her orders without asking questions. By the time jury selection began, very few people in the valley still believed Lorraine's version of events, and even fewer were willing to say so publicly on her behalf. Months passed before the dust of the entire ordeal truly settled. Whitmore Ridge Ranch continued operating, much as it always had its rhythms of work returning to something close to normal. The eastern fence was rebuilt sturdier than before, and the association was made to cover damages tied to the trespass through a combination of insurance payouts and a civil settlement negotiated well outside the courtroom. Silas never pushed to dismantle Silver Crest Estates itself, understanding clearly that most of its residents had been just as deceived by Lorraine as anyone else caught up in her scheme. When the newly elected board reached out and asked him to attend an open community meeting, he agreed to sit down and listen to what they had to say. They wanted to discuss in a lawful and transparent way the possibility of limited emergency access along a small section of that same disputed road. Silas told them he was open to the conversation, but only under conditions that left no room for future misunderstandings. Everything would need to be documented in writing, valued fairly by an independent appraiser, and agreed to freely, with no one ever again attempting to claim rights through intimidation or fabricated paperwork. Wade joked afterward that the association had apparently finally learned what a property line actually meant. Silas replied that what they had really learned was what a federal warrant meant, and the distinction, he added, mattered more than people tended to assume. The final and most striking moment of the entire case arrived during Lorraine's sentencing hearing months later. Prosecutors displayed 2 photographs side by side for the courtroom to see. The first showed 12 workers bound along a fence line early that morning, Lorraine standing confidently behind them as though she had already won. The second showed the same fence line minutes later, a line of unmarked federal vehicles rolling through the gate she had ordered seized. The presiding judge remarked in a tone that silenced the entire room that Lorraine Ashford had spent more than a year attempting to transform the limited administrative authority of a homeowners association into something resembling actual law enforcement power. A homeowners association, the judge reminded her plainly, was not a court, it was not a police department, and it could never manufacture ownership over land simply by sending armed guards to physically occupy it. Lorraine was led out of the courtroom without another word, her expression finally emptied of the confidence that had carried her through so many months of manipulation. Outside on the courthouse steps, Cole Brennan caught up with Silas and asked him one last question that had clearly been sitting with him for weeks. He wanted to know whether Silas had somehow known Lorraine would raid the ranch that exact morning. Silas shook his head and told him plainly that he hadn't known anything of the sort. Cole laughed, despite everything pointing out the strange irony of it all, that Lorraine had ended up arresting his entire crew on the very morning. Silas happened to be on his way to arrest her instead. Silas glanced back toward the courthouse behind them and admitted that yes, essentially, that was exactly what had happened. Naomi, standing nearby, added that in her years working federal cases, she had rarely seen a defendant do so much of the prosecution's work for them without any outside pressure at all. Russell agreed, noting that most fraud cases took years to build a paper trail, as complete as the one Lorraine had personally carried out of a ranch office in her own bag. Cole shook his head, still somewhat amazed that a woman so determined to control every detail of her plan had ultimately been undone by her own instinct to grab evidence rather than leave it behind. Wade laughed too as they walked toward the parking lot together, the tension of the past year finally beginning to loosen from his shoulders. Silas climbed into his truck, and before pulling the door shut, he looked out toward the distant outline of the ranch on the horizon, quiet now, under an ordinary afternoon sky. Lorraine had once believed that detaining a handful of ranch workers would be enough to finally force Silas Whitmore into submission. Instead, her decision that morning had produced 13 witnesses willing to testify against her hours of damning security footage and an entirely new crime scene delivered directly into the hands of the very federal warrant she never saw coming. Lorraine sent armed guards to prove she controlled Silas Whitmore's ranch. By sunset, the only property she still controlled was the evidence bag carrying her own name.